Hello, everybody. It is 8:40. It's Thursday. I think it's Friday. It's a long week. So this is a couple of things I think I'm going to talk about on this live stream. If you're out there, feel free to jump into the comments. And I apologize for my voice. I'm getting these like crazy allergies, and I moved kind of across the country to a different state. I'm just not used to the allergies they have out there. So it's a little nuts. Okay, anyways, so um, I wanted to talk a little bit about this new show. Well, it's actually not a new show, it's in its second season. It's called The Rehearsal. It's on HBO or Max or whatever they call that these days. Um, and it's this guy, Nathan Fielder, who's kind of a comedian, kind of a, I don't know, sort of writer, just sort of entertainment guy in general. Makes various forms of shows and movies and things. And he's a pretty funny guy, and the show is a little. Well, it's very odd. For those of you who have seen it, you know exactly what I'm talking about. For those of you who haven't, this isn't going to spoil it too much. There's a few spoilers, but this is not the type of show where you really can be spoiled. It's more of an experience than anything. So, but it has to do or the people talk about it in terms of it sort of reflects sort of the new generation of humor, like Gen Z's humor, and I think the guy who does it is probably a millennial, but it's sort of reflective of the current what's accepted as funny or humorous out there, and it's this idea of hyper realism where things are serious but they're also supposed to be funny, and you don't really know, like, am I supposed to laugh at this or am I supposed to take this seriously? And I guess it's a pretty good commentary on just sort of the way things are these days. Because as a Gen Xer, I mean, we grew up laughing at everything, even all the stuff we weren't supposed to. And now you have this whole generation of kids that, my kids are in that generation, and they've been told their whole life to not laugh at anything. And so there's this weird kind of thing going on in humor. So that's an aside. But it is an interesting show. There's a lot of interesting sort of think pieces on it and what it represents, as far as humor and entertainment. Excuse me. So, but what I wanted to talk about is we're in season 2, and the season is somewhat dedicated to airline pilots and sort of digging into um, basically some concerns about airline pilots and crashes and airline safety. And I'm going to take it aside real quick because airline pilots are very interesting. They're sort of an interesting group of people because they're studied a lot in psychology. In fact, we had 2 or 3 labs at the grad school that I was at dedicated to like just studying airline pilots and aviation and flight simulators and all that. And there's probably a lot of reasons for it because obviously if something goes wrong, it's catastrophic, and so they study pilot. There's a lot of defense funding, and there's money there. So it's very well funded, so it gets researched quite a bit. More on that later. Um, but there's this interesting phenomenon out there that the show sort of taps onto. And it's been sort of this sort of working theory for a while about, when they investigate major airline crashes, and they sort of go through the pilot's logs of what happened right before the crash. there, especially in sort of Asian countries where there's like a very hierarchical, society. There's this issue of, co-pilots not speaking up, or there just not being a whole lot of communication between the pilots. Let's put it that way. Right before it crashed, and with some theories out there, speculation that if they had talked more, or if the co-pilot was able to sort of express knowledge that they had that they were afraid to share because of the social dynamic or whatever, that maybe they would have avoided this plane crash. And so that sort of argument has been out there, for years, for at least 20, maybe 30 years, maybe even longer than that. But the rehearsal sort of acts like it sort of stumbled across this phenomenon, and wasn't really going into it looking for it. But for whatever reason, let's just assume, that that's the case. You see the show is sort of just recording. It's sort of a documentary format, so it's recording these pilots, and they're sort of going through flight simulation and stuff. But the guy who's directing it is also sort of in the show, and he starts talking about how he noticed that the pilots just don't talk to each other a whole lot. There's all this footage of them just sort of standing right next to each other and like not saying a word, right? They're about ready to go fly a flight or something, and they're just standing there not talking to anybody, and just not even looking at each other. And then there's sort of this social event at a bar where two pilots sort of interact, and they're like, "Hey, what do you fly?" And he tells them, and then they just start looking around, and okay, that's cool. And they really just have very little interaction with each other. And so he's the director, showrunner, whatever, the guy does the show, is trying to find sort of like a reason behind this. Like, why do these pilots just not talk to each other, right? And he's also looking at the flight data, before crashes and stuff, and then also sort of the famous Sully landing in the Hudson, and notice that there's just not a whole lot of interaction between the pilots, with maybe the Sully event being sort of slight counterexample to it, and that might have been why they were successful, is this argument. And but he takes a very different approach, and this is sort of the crux of what I want to get into here. And his argument is that the pilots are afraid to talk to each other and are afraid to engage with each other because they're worried that if too much about their personality gets out, that they'll have to go through some sort of medical evaluation and maybe get quote unquote grounded, right? Not be able to fly. Because they're afraid that, if they sort of share their true feelings about things, that, for whatever reason, that might come across as, showing some sort of, mental health issue or something. And that, they're just sort of naturally guarded, right? And don't want to share all this information. And that it's not really, quote unquote, a problem with them, or it's not inherent to them, but instead it's sort of this systematic thing, right, that's causing them to be like that. And not only that, but it could sort of manifest itself or generate these catastrophic outcomes, right? Where if they're afraid to talk to each other, if they sort of built up this shell of their personality, and they're afraid to express their opinions or their emotions or whatever, that it hurts the communication between the pilots. And if there's a crisis, they've sort of developed this social relationship where it's hard to, express what you're thinking. And by the time you sort of get over it, it's too late. So that's one way of looking at it. And we can also look at it, like I tend to do, through the cognitive function lens, right? And really ask yourself, do these guys have a problem? Right? I mean, would you necessarily characterize it as a quote unquote problem? Or is it just sort of evidence of a pretty strong personality type, right? Or, maybe a strong version of a couple of personality types. And I would argue it's probably you're thinking it's going this way, that, pilots, by and large, not all of them, obviously, but enough of them that where you could staff one of these shows, are probably very hardcore ISTJs and some INTJs in there. They're probably very FE polar, right? And if you think about it, if you're FE polar, an airplane pilot is like the best job for you, right? Because you have all these gadgets, all this gear that you have to learn about, right? And figure out how it all works. And of course, if you're an ISTJ, that's like, you can do that in your sleep. And get to play with all these gadgets. And then it's very systematic, it's very routine. And you literally sit there all day without having to talk to anybody or interact with anybody, other than maybe your co-pilot, the stewardess that comes in every once in a while, I don't know, the air tower, air traffic control, whatever. But you don't have to like sit there and just talk to people all day. So it's the perfect job for an ISTJ or an INTJ, probably. And so you're probably going to have it overly staffed and overly represented by ISTJs and INTJs that are FE polar. And because they're FE polar, they sort of gravitate to jobs like this, right? Where they don't have to interact with people and they get to interact with these complicated, fancy machines, right? And so then you would expect that when you look at, the flight records and stuff of disasters and catastrophes, there's probably not a whole lot of talking because they probably weren't spending a lot of time talking at any point, right? Or communicating, all that much at any point because they're perfectly happy being ISTJs. And, you see them in sort of the wild, right? When they're at these social functions or bars and they just stand there looking around. And there's one guy in particular that sort of becomes like the main focus of the show. And he is super ISTJ, super FE polar. And that's sort of like they're trying to get him to engage, his FE or, with people a little bit more. Now, of course, I'll get into that in a second because he's got it backwards, but whatever. So, but going back to my point, my original point is, so if the idea is, let's try to socialize these people and get them more comfortable socializing with each other. Okay. But you don't want to do it at the expense of just saying we need more social people, right? Because you can imagine that somebody's sort of taking this logically too far and saying, well, so if we want to avoid these disasters, we need the chatty Cathys or the people who are going to talk to each other and, figure out a solution or whatever, collaborate, not be afraid to talk. And, so if that starts becoming a criteria as as people are hiring pilots, you're going to start filtering out the ISTJs, right? And the INTJs to the extent that factor carries any sort of significant weight in your hiring decision. And you better be careful about weeding out the ISTJs and the INTJs because they are by far going to be the best pilots. And yeah, you might have some catastrophes, less than 1% of the time. But 99.9% of the time, they're doing everything correctly, right? And they're ISTJs or INTJs, and they know how to work those machines. And you start putting a bunch of, touchy-feely INFJs or INFPs or ENFJs in there, we're not going to be able to figure out those machines. And so, you're going to see a whole other line of, catastrophic disasters. And there'll be plenty of chatting, in the record before the plane crashes. But it's going to be, it's going to be such and such INFJ flipped on the wrong switch or whatever at the wrong time. And so this brings me to sort of my larger point of, sometimes you just have to accept the trade-offs in life, right? You have to accept that you're going to have a bunch of ISTJs and INTJs, to some extent ESTJs, flying these super complicated machines, right? And yeah, there's going to be some situations where it would have helped if they had talked to each other and weren't sort of FE polar, right? And collaborated a little bit more. But in comparison to the sheer number of disasters you could have if you don't have somebody who knows what they're doing flying these planes, we'll take that trade-off, right? And yeah, maybe you could sort of, do these little coaching sessions, and that's kind of what the rehearsal is about, is these little coaching sessions of trying to get this guy to be a little bit more socially engaged. But be careful what you wish for, right? Like he's got a job to do, and I'm sure he's very good at it. And so we don't want him getting too socialized. And then I could go in two different directions here. I'm trying to figure out which direction I want to go in. Because there's a couple of points I want to make real quickly. Obviously they're not looking at this through cognitive function, Jungian functions or anything like that, psychological types. They should be, but they're not. And their argument is that he has a hard time expressing his feelings. He doesn't have a hard time expressing his feelings. He's an ISTJ. He'll tell you what he thinks about something. He has a hard time just engaging, right? And so it's a very telling example of the difference between FI and FE and how people just get it sort of wrong, like just in the general population, like how people sort of have a hard time or just don't differentiate between engagement and then, deliberation, FI deliberation. So again, I don't think he's got a problem with FI. I think he's got a problem with FE. Now, of course, people can argue that that's all part of FE, is knowing what you want and being able to express yourself fine, But there's just parts of the show where they're clearly talking about him having FI problems, but it's really he's having FE problems. So don't let that confuse you. And again, they're not looking at it through the same framework we are. So take that to heart. Okay, and so the nature of the show is to try to get people to rehearse, critical or situations that are going to be, sort of life-changing big events, and they sort of rehearse them before the actual event happens, so that way they're ready for it when it happens. And obviously, airline pilots go through a lot of rehearsal with flight simulators and all that kind of stuff. And so, but this is, the show just takes it to a whole other level. If you watch the show, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Of just simulating things. And so they're trying to simulate date situations and stuff with him. And he's just so FE polar, just so obviously FE polar. And, and they're, and, and instead of giving him like, hey, do this or hey, do that. They do that a little, and I think it does help. They do give him some little pointers, some little rules that he could use in sort of a TE way, right? Um, but he's always going to be FE polar, and then it makes you wonder, like, and here is sort of my big rant. So get ready for my big rant. And this is sort of the old man yelling at old man yelling at cloud part of the video. So the underlying theme here is that, that there's something. I mean, I'll just say it out, say it out loud, that there's something wrong with this guy, right? Now, of course, yeah, these are millennials making this show. They're never going to say there's anything wrong with somebody, but just that, he tends to be, he's got something lacking, or something that could be worked on, or something that could be developed. And by not developing it, he's putting the world at risk, right? Because, we've sort of identified this thing as being the problem when there's an airplane crash, right? And by letting people sort of, have an underdeveloped social skills, um, we're, putting ourselves in danger, right? It's a very millennial way of looking at the world, that like if there's something off, if there's something like somebody, doesn't fall into the normal curve, they're somewhere out on the edge of the normal bell curve, then, it's not a problem. We've all sort of learned to accept it as what it is, but we're going to work on it, because if we don't, somebody's going to die, or there's going to be some tragic event. And and I don't know if it's the helicopter parenting that the millennials grew up with or what. I think it really all stems to Columbine. I have a whole theory on that, but that's for another day. Like the shooting at Columbine, it really changed the whole world. 9/11 obviously did too, but and so it just became this. And I'm going to get into that. It's like the psych field in general and what it says about that. And so that's what, I mean, I do like the show. I think I mean, everybody's calling it, a work of genius and the best show on TV. Sure, fine. But I don't like the messaging. I don't like this messaging that, just because somebody is a little socially awkward or FE polar or however you want to put it, or just doesn't want to talk to people, right? There's nothing wrong with that. It's like, they're fine. They're just FE polar, right? And to me, that's sort of the beauty of understanding the cognitive functions, and what Jung, I think, was trying to get at, is that you can kind of understand where people are coming from if you understand these functions. And if you understand them, then you can accept them, right? And it's not like, oh, this guy's an ISTJ, he's FE polar, and he's putting the world at risk because if there's an imminent plane crash, he's not going to be able to talk his way out of the situation. I mean, what are we telling ourselves here, right? I mean, he's probably preventing 99.9% of the plane crashes that could happen, because he's, precisely because he's not trying to engage in talking to other people, and he's not sitting there thinking about, different social dynamics or relationships, or did he say the wrong thing the other day at dinner? None of that's going on. He's just thinking about his machines, right? He's just thinking about getting his plane and his passengers, to where they need to be. And trying to sort of gin up this, like, you know, he's F, he's got something wrong with social engagement. We need to work on that, because, we're going to make him into a more of a whole person, and that's going to save the world. That messaging just rubs me so wrong. I mean, why can't we just accept that that's just the way he is? And the fact that he is that way is what gives him his superpower, right? Of being a good pilot. We need people like that. And so it goes to my sort of general point about all this psychology, all this cognitive function stuff and psychological types is that, there is a reason that evolution, I got to come in here. Yeah, I'll get to your point. That's a good point. Um, so again, I mean, there's evolution sort of created these 16 personality types. How, I don't know, but for some reason we got them, and we fill in the cracks by having different personality types. If we are all ISFJs, the village down the street that has all ESTPs is going to come and take all of our food, and there's nothing we can do about it because we're all ISFJs. If we're all ESTPs, then all the INTJs are going to figure out a way to dig tunnels or whatever and get in and steal all your food. There's nothing you can do about it because you're an ESTP and not an INTJ. And so on and so forth. And so we have all these different personality types, like the ISTJ, that fit sort of this role of culture or society. And we shouldn't be tinkering with that. We should be accepting it and saying, we need the INTJs and the ISTJs to be running the airplanes. Nobody else wants to do it. Maybe some ESTPs, like back in the day when planes were new and it was more of an adventure. But now it's all just a bunch of computers and electronics. And I mean, just think about it. And you have to sit there for 5-6 hours and not talk, right? So do you really want the ENFP and the INFJ trying to fly this plane? I mean, just think about it. Okay, so sometimes the world sort of settles in the way that it's supposed to, right? And don't go tinkering with it. And yeah, there might be some cases at the margins where it would have been nice if they had talked to each other a little bit more. I understand, but in the multiverse where you've got the INFJ and the ENFP serving as pilot and co-pilot, yeah. I'll take the ISTJ and INTJ pilots any day of the week. Okay. So one sec here. I'm getting a few comments here. So I'm going to divert myself here. I'm reading these out loud. So hopefully there's nothing untoward in them. I think the polar function is not a function you don't value. Yeah, I do think you do value your polar function. I think it is one of the valued, however Eric breaks that down. I think it does fall into a function that you do value. I just don't value it in myself. I value it in other people. You enjoy the fruits of your polar, but don't want to be responsible for doing it. Yeah. I mean, I can get that. Like I'm SI polar. Okay. I still enjoy good food and comfort, but don't want to do the work to create it. Okay. Right, because we need competent people. Focus on solving practical problems. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, I will be the first to admit when I talk about the polar function, I do sort of sarcastically disparage it. But but in a very loving way. It's like, it's like making fun of your little brother kind of thing, right? And I do agree that, if you're TE polar and you somehow through the grace of God achieve some sort of TE task, yes, that makes you feel super special. And you do value it in that way. And also like when you see it in other people, when I see the ISTJs and the INTJs, doing their TE stuff to fly planes and whatnot, that's super impressive. I mean, it's just not something that I would do. I mean, maybe 20, 30 years ago, I might have, tried to convince myself that I should try that. And then, I'd spend 2 weeks trying it and realizing, yeah, I'd rather do something else. But I do. I mean, certainly respect it, certainly admire it, and that's kind of my general point is that we all should, and we should also just sort of accept the fact that there's going to be trade-offs because that's what your brain does. If it has to engage in one function, it's going to inhibit the other function so that it's not interfering with it, right? And that's just the way that it works. Yeah, so can you imagine if we used FE to pilot planes? Everything is fine while the plane is crashing, right? Now, of course, we are in this weird social intersection where AI, of course, and automation is going to take over more and more of the pilot's role. And if you talk to I know a couple of pilots, they're like husbands of people I work with. And they'll all tell you that, it's pretty automated already. Like, they could just punch a couple of buttons and take off and land. But to me, yeah, but you got to still punch the buttons, right? You got to still know which buttons to punch and, which gate to show up at and all that kind of stuff. So, we're not completely automated. Um, but you could see, and again, this is why I have a problem with this millennial messaging of, we have like a small problem of like less than 1% of the use cases, and so we got to tinker with it and fix it. No, we don't need to tinker with anything. We don't need to fix anything. Um, keep our I'm gonna go like rally side to keep our ISTJs in the airplane. Okay, and that goes into the bigger political things of DEI and all that, and whether or not you're hiring the right person for the right job. And I don't want to get into that because it's very politically charged, and that is opening up other things that aren't relevant to this conversation. But but at the core, there is this issue of hire the right people for the right job, right? Let's not go tinkering too much. And in the cognitive function area, we don't need to sit in ESFP or an ESFJ or an ENFJ in there just to talk to them. I mean, all they're going to do is distract. um, okay, so the show is very interesting, and if you watch it from that perspective of like, he's sort of tinkering with their FE and trying to, pressing from all these different sides. There's some real interesting FE polar examples in there. Let's see here. To answer the valued, unvalued question clearly, we need to agree on definition of the term value. As an ISTJ, I appreciate it when I'm in an atmosphere of FE is working. I neither want to be responsible for it doing the work it takes to produce it. I don't like it. Okay, yeah. I mean, I think that's a pretty valid way of looking at it. I do kind of see your fourth function as being a little like that too, maybe even more so of I'll do it, but I'd like some help with it. And you better not make me in charge of it. Right? Like if you're FE polar or maybe FE four stack, FE, fourth function, fourth slot. It's like, yeah, I'll help you organize your party, but don't make me in charge of it, right? Like, don't make me be the one that has to like call everybody and get all the food, all that kind of stuff, and send out the invitations, blah 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 blah. Like, I'll help where help is needed, but don't make me in charge of it. That's a very sort of INTP, ISTP, fourth function FE slot, right? FE polar is probably a little more like I'm just not even going to touch it. Like I'm not. You plan your own party, and if I'm in the mood, I'll show up. But it's a little different. Yeah. Okay. All right. So let's see here. Oh, I got two different people. Okay. I was like, why is this guy flipping personalities on me? Okay. Um, Don't want to be responsible for it or take the work. Yeah, I don't like it. Okay. So that's our buddy Shane. And then John says, I'm an INFJ and TI feels aspirational. Um, I can sort of. Did you mean FI or TI? Because TI is obviously not your polar function. Um, it's frustrating to see an FE at work making big things happen undeservedly, in my opinion. Yep. That's the whole. It's who you know, not what you know. Um, it's like a mental deficiency. Yeah. So, Jonathan, I'm curious. Have you done one of Eric talking with famous people's um, typing sessions? And if so, how did you do on the SI? Tell me about your day kind of questioning. Because when he gets an ENTJ, which happens every once in a while, it's so funny to watch that. It's just so. It's one of the few polar tests where it's just clear right off the bat. Like TE polar, if somebody's TE polar, to me, it's pretty clear right off the bat. And I would imagine it's for a lot of people, even people who aren't TE polar. And then if somebody's SI polar, it's pretty clear right off the bat as well. For me, I remember the concept, but not the details. Yeah, that would be SI polar. Yeah, so TI is suggestive inferior in sociotics and BTI. Okay. Um, yeah. Right. Yeah. Go and get the food. Yeah. Because, well, if you're forced to do something, you might as well do the thing that's away from the people, right? If you're FE polar. Okay. So, want to move on to my next point, but keep the comments coming. I'll come back to it in a minute here, but I don't want to lose my steam here on um, the sort of the bigger point I wanted to make about this whole millennial tinkering thing. And I apologize to all the millennials. I know you're not all like this, but you have your generation to blame for this because they're just such tinkers. They just want to fix everything. And in the psychology field or psychiatry field, however you want to look at it, it's so mixed together now that it's hardly any distinction. Um, it sort of traces back to just the change in the funding. I mean, if you want to know like what's going on with at sort of a systematic or society level, you got to just follow the money. And one thing to sort of keep in mind, and this is also came up in some other comments and other videos about different functions and whether what role they play in neurodiversity and stuff like that. And I don't really want to get into that because there's a lot. I have a very controversial take on some of that stuff, which is probably going to show in a second here. But this is just kind of NI food for thought. I'm not really. I don't even know why I'm getting into it other than just to sort of rant on it. But so there's this clear difference between what happened in the 90s the 80s and the 90s and to some extent the 70s in the psychology field and then like the 2000s on. And there are a few big things. And I mentioned 9/11, Columbine, that was a big thing. But back in the 80s and 90s and to some extent the 70s, like psychology was like space exploration. Like we were just trying to figure out what's going on, right? What part of the brain is doing what? How does attention work? How does memory work? How is it all structured? Blah 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 blah. But it was all discovery, and I've made videos like this before, but I'm going to rant on it again. And it was just knowing for the sake of knowing, right? And yeah, there was counseling psychology, there was psychiatry, which was sort of, its own little niche area, that was more sort of applied psychology, trying to help people. But it really wasn't. I mean, that was more geared towards people who are like at way ends of the spectrum, right? And people with what we would call at the time disorders, and I think you can't even call them disorders anymore. I don't know what you call them. And the idea would be, you had a disorder if you couldn't function, like you couldn't live by yourself or hold down a job or just do day-to-day tasks, to take care of yourself, right? Schizophrenia, major bipolar, major depression, not, somewhere on the spectrum, but like you couldn't literally get out of bed and do, take care of yourself, like that bad. Or if you're so bipolar, we couldn't allow you to have a checking account because as soon as you had, a manic uh, um, epic or experience, you'd run through your entire bank account, right? So it's things like that where it was like you were a danger to yourself and others, right? If we didn't help you. Um, but that was its own little sort of fringe area, and Reagan and all his stuff of like, defunding mental hospitals, and then that sort of started things, moving. But what really happened is in the late 80s, early 90s, I forget when exactly, Prozac came out. And Prozac was the first SSRI inhibitor. I think it's SSRI inhibitor. But it was like your first like drug for depression. And it was a major success, like a major hit, like right off the bat. And everybody wanted Prozac, and they were writing books about it. It was on Oprah. It was just everywhere. Everybody felt like they needed Prozac, and everybody all of a sudden decided that they were depressed all the time. And the psychiatrist just couldn't write enough, prescriptions for this thing. And so the drug companies obviously found out, like, oh, wow, this is interesting. We could just tell people that they've got a disorder and sell a bunch of drugs, right? And you saw ADD switch into ADHD so that they could, increase the number of people who had the quote unquote disorder. Around in the mid 90s, the DSM-4 came out and it changed the criteria. So instead of having to get sort of, before there's sort of like three different things are all grouped together, they sort of split it into another one where you had to get one out of three to be have ADHD, and so it just made it so a lot easier to get ADHD, right, or to be diagnosed as ADHD. And of course, there's the drug stuff going on, right? But ADHD, I think they gave him Ritalin, and I don't know if that was patented or not, or who was making money off of that, but I'm sure somebody was. But the thing is, and this is just my own little personal experience, but take it for what it's worth, and it's always been my attitude about ADHD. The one kid that I knew in high school, because remember, I went to high school in like the early 90s, and ADD was around, ADHD was sort of this new thing. But there's one person that I knew had been diagnosed with ADHD. One person out of my entire class. And you're probably like, oh my God. And it was a normal sized high school. And there might have been more, but I didn't know of them. But the one person I knew was our valedictorian. He got a 35 on the ACT, free ride to BYU. He was Mormon. Was our valedictorian with a higher than 4.0 GPA due to extra credit or whatever. Smartest guy I've ever known. Best student I've ever known. And he's diagnosed as ADHD, right? And he's taking drugs for ADHD. And so you could say, okay, well, he's a miracle. That, he's proof that, that the drugs and the therapy work. Or you could say it's all bullshit. Because if you look at the diagnostic, criteria, it's stuff like, has a hard time, focusing on a task, doesn't pay attention to details, walks around when they should be sitting, is fidgety and all this stuff. And he wasn't any of that, and like, paying attention to detail. I mean, the guy was like, taking like fourth calculus 3, in high school, right? I mean, of course he knew how to pay attention to detail. So again, maybe Ritalin was the miracle drug and we all should have been on it, or whoever was diagnosing this was just full of shit. So this was always kind of my attitude. And then I went into grad school, and it became even clearer, because and this is really the point I'm trying to get to. So in the 90s, you could pretty much do any research you wanted on just, at a discovery level, because what was going on is like the technology was like booming. And so like in computers, in, servers and networking, storage systems. I mean, we had a new storage device come out every like 6 months, from like, the floppy disk to zip drive. Those of you who are around will remember, then CD-ROMs, and then network servers and everything. Every 6 months we were, changing our whole lab up for these new memory things. And the computer companies, IBM and Windows and Mac, I mean, they're all fighting with each other, and they're all trying to gain market share. And so they're just giving stuff away, right? So if you wanted a lab to do research, I mean, it was so easy to just write a grant and get funded, because these technology companies were trying to, they were inventing new stuff, and they were trying to get market share. And so the best way to get market share is to have a bunch of universities using your stuff, right? And then the students learn to use your stuff, and then they go on and, use your stuff when they get their job, and so on and so forth, right? That's how Microsoft Office spread. That's how Mac spread. And so, then MRI machines were coming out, ERP machines were relatively new. But there was a lot of software, a lot of statistical software, a lot of experiment software that was all coming out, and it was dirt cheap because they wanted everybody to use it. And so you could get funding, relatively easily, just to do discovery work, right? Microsoft wasn't trying to sell pills, right? They weren't trying to cure anything. They just knew that you were into research, and you needed computers, and you needed storage space. So here you go. Okay. So then, in the late 90s, they started shifting the funding into terrorism and counterterrorism. And it was even before 9/11. And, because there actually were a couple of terrorist attacks. A lot of people forget that the World Trade Center was attacked with a bomb in like the parking garage in like 93. And that sort of opened up, things started shifting to anti-terrorism. So a lot of the funding we were getting were from, government agents like, CIA, DARPA, that kind of stuff. But again, it was all just sort of discovery. Wasn't trying to fix anybody. It was, more just trying to figure, the way that it would be applied, in like counterterrorism, military kind of uses. Then 9/11 happens, and then everything's off the book. Everything, like, immediately everything shifts to like, you could not get a penny out of DC unless it was somehow connected to counterterrorism or defense contracting. And this was the lifeblood of research, was getting NIH, NSF, and then various other smaller grants from the federal government. So what ended up happening is, if you want to do research, you got to get funding. You got to have the money. And the big tech companies, there was also the big tech crash. So the tech companies were sort of running for the hills because they had their own problems. They weren't giving out free shit anymore. And they really didn't have to worry about market share or any of that stuff anymore, because like 90% of their competition died away in the early 2000 crash. Then we had, funding being cut off from DC, or by and large, like it was very hard to get funding unless you had like a direct line to some sort of counterterrorism or military use or something, because that's where all the money in DC was. So what ended up happening is the drug companies obviously started, ponying up more. And if you wanted to just research attention, you couldn't just research attention in and of itself. Like, how does attention work in you and me? You had to research it, like, how does it work or not work in ADHD or something like that, or adult onset. So if you wanted to study attention in adults, now all of a sudden adults had to have ADHD or you weren't going to get money, right, for your funding. So, not trying to point any fingers or anything, but that was just the nature of it. And then the food companies, of course, are all involved, at some point, trying to fund brain, healthy food for brains and stuff like that. But really, they just want the data, for their lobbying efforts or whatever. And so you saw this just boom, this, massive explosion, and, talking about who has ADHD and who doesn't, who has autism and who doesn't. And it just got to the point where we just describe it differently. So if somebody says autism to me, I think about like how we thought about it in the 90s, right? Somebody who's a millennial or Gen Z has a totally different concept of what autism is. And I'll watch TikTok videos where somebody's just going on talking about normal stuff in their day, and then they're just like, oh, and then my autism kicked in. Autism doesn't just kick in. And you're not making TikTok videos or in any coherent way, at least in the sort of 90s understanding of autism. So it's a very different take, right? And depression and bipolar and all that is very different. And I'm not trying to say that there aren't people, that it's all made up. It clearly isn't. It was around before I studied any of this stuff. But again, the treatment was for people who like literally could not function without the treatment. But now it's more of just like, where are you on the spectrum kind of thing. And that brings me back to the reunion after that long rant of where like the psychology today and psychiatry and whatnot, it's like it's all geared towards trying to tinker with things and fix things. Like people who get into cognitive functions and Jungian personality, yeah, I mean, it comes from a psychoanalyst, and yeah, he was trying to fix people, so I'll give you that. But there's also this whole other tradition of just knowing things just for the sake of knowing them, not trying to tweak anything or tinker with anything or fix anything, just understanding, like, that's the way it is. Like, why do we have so many ISTJs, flying planes? Or put another way, why do we have so many people who don't like social interaction flying planes? You can explain it through this cognitive function, and it's fine. You don't need to tinker with it. You don't need to fix it. You don't need to give him some drugs or anything like that to make his brain more balanced. It's just what it is, right? And, but for the past 20, 30 years, because if you follow the money, it's all about trying to fix things, as opposed to in the 90s and the 80s, it was just all about having fun, figuring out what was going on. And, and you weren't relying on the pill makers to fund you, and you didn't have to find a reason, why something's wrong, but I mean, it was creeping in there. It certainly was there, but it was seen as sort of an additional source of money, like, the Alzheimer's Association. If you studied memory, they'd kick in a few bucks. And I certainly saw the trajectory, coming. I was sort of on the tail end of it. So, but the 70s and the 80s, it was just like trying to figure out who you are. You went to a therapist, you know, really to just kind of, iron out the wrinkles, right? You're not trying to sew patches in anything or fix anything. You're just ironing out the wrinkles, right? You're just trying to figure out who you are, trying to self actualize. And a lot of that is just, learning to accept who you are and who other people are and not make a big fucking deal out of it, right? Um, and I'm hoping that maybe Gen Z will pick up on that. And I think that goes back to the idea of what Gen Z humor, of how it's kind of hyper realism, where you don't know if it's funny or not. Like it seems funny, but you're not sure if you're supposed to be laughing at it or not. And I don't know if that's a sign of anything, them not taking stuff so seriously. Because I think it's all sort of tongue in cheek, right? Like they're taking it seriously, ironically, right? As opposed to millennials who are taking it seriously, but you know, but earnest in earnest, right? Like they really mean to take it seriously. And so maybe there'll be a shift, but who knows? I mean, we're still going to have all these pills and whatnot as the patents run out and they come out with new ones. So we'll see where that ends up. Okay, going back to the comments. Thank you for going with me on my journey on that rant there. See, otherwise unrelated talent staff member. Okay, yeah. So this is going back to just not liking Effie. TI suggested for okay for me. I remember the concept, not the details. That's like POLR. SSR. Okay, yeah. Prozac was the SSRI. Right, yeah, take inhibitor. Yeah, I think it was one of the first ones. Pharmaceutical companies is not going to challenge the status quo. You are right about that. That's a good point. So there's a comment about this guy making the comment. Actually, has a very similar background to me. Neuroscience. They went to law school. It sounds like. So he points out that there, like, you could get accommodations for taking the LSAT, and just by saying you have ADHD or something, which opens up another rant that I was going to make because I personally know very well somebody who was part of the part of the program that evaluated the No Child Left Behind program from the Bush administration. And for those of you who might not remember, Bush had this famous or infamous program called No Child Left Behind, where all the teachers who in the public schools had to start. They started testing all the kids, and then the kids had to achieve a certain amount, or the teachers started getting in trouble. Of course, the teachers' unions fought it tooth and nail, but whatever. Or the schools would get, in trouble, like they'd be put on watch lists and all this kind of stuff, right? There's supposed to be consequences, if the students weren't doing well, and the students could like decide to leave and go to a different school or something like that. But part of the program was also to evaluate the teachers who were, doing the testing, administering the testing, and and to kind of see how they were doing. And the people that I knew were involved in that. So I got sort of this inside view of it, and I'm sure there's people out there that have seen the same thing, where the schools now all of a sudden were worried about losing their funding. losing their students, blah, 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 if the kids weren't passing these tests. So what was one way of, getting some kids excluded from the test scores was to say that they had a learning disability. And my sister's a school psychologist too. So she would run all these tests, like it was a boom time, like a booming time for her. Because now all of a sudden they needed to evaluate everybody to see if they had a learning disability or ADHD or whatever. Because if they were going to be sort of on, let's just say, the lower end of the spectrum on these, No Child Left Behind tests, you'd want to either get them excluded or somehow their scores are weighted differently or something like that. So that was a whole other thing, right? And so again, it's that tinkering, right? It's this is coming from a Republican government, which is supposed to be the non-tinkerers, but just this idea of just like we're gonna, we know what the problem is. Everybody step aside. We're gonna fix it, right? We're going to put an INFJ and an ENFP into the cockpit and have them fly it. Because if they get into any problem, they'll talk it out. And then 30 seconds later, the plane's going into the lake. But, because you just don't do that. And so this idea that, hey, we found out, the cause of, less than 1% of the use cases or problems doesn't mean you have to just throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. Okay. And so for those of you who are a little younger and you're getting into the personality stuff and all this cognitive function, yeah, it's cool to dream and to have, aspirational functions. And one day, you INFJs, you might have your ballet recital or whatever you're going to use your fully developed SE on. I fully support you in your dreams. However, if the day comes where you decide that you're just going to appreciate who you are and appreciate the fact that there's, some ESFPs and, lead SE people out there that, are just born to dance, that's cool too. All right. Anything else here? Yeah. Oh, I remember. Just the comment about the LSAT and being able to take it with, what is it, 1.5% of the time? Yeah. So you get 50% extra minutes. And the whole point of the LSAT is it's timed. And so you have to think quickly. And to the extent, intelligence is tied to how quickly you respond, then, there's something there. And if you give somebody more time, it sort of defeats the whole purpose. Because it's not, the LSAT for most people, most people, it's not about being able to figure out the right answer. It's about being able to figure out the right answer quickly. It's very different. If you give them, if you give everybody a week to figure out the right answer, they'll figure it out. It's almost 10 score difference. Wow. Yeah. Yeah. And then they show up to law school. And I don't know if you've been to law school yet, but you certainly know who they are quickly. But yeah. But I mean, ultimately, I like to think, at least in law school, the people who deserve law school is one of the few institutions or one of the few systems that I think is actually it generates the results that it intends to generate. And I know people will disagree with me, but that's just because they didn't do good in law school, didn't do well in law school. But in general, law school, if you're a hard worker, like, conscientious and put in a lot of effort, and you're smart, if you have that combination, you will do well in law school. If you're lacking in either of them, especially if you're not a hard worker, you'll just sort of end up in the middle of the pack. You can't outsmart law school. Like I knew a lot of smart people in law school that didn't do well because they just didn't put in the work. They were the classic ENTP, INTP. You know, ENTP doesn't really care about the grade, or so they say. INTP just can't get themselves out of their own head to get whatever paper done, or really to finish it is really to get it done. So whatever people get on the LSAT, I realize it directly affects which school you get into and all that. And to that extent, it really does suck. But if you do get into a pretty good school and a good region that you want to be in, the cream does rise to the crop or rise to the top, in my opinion, in law school. You don't see it in many other schools, but law school definitely. I'd be happy to listen to you start in September. Okay, cool. Yeah. Well, good luck. I mean, law school is such a bitch. Yeah, just turn off everything in your personal life, like whatever you got going on in your personal life, whether it's family, friends, girlfriends, whatever. My best advice is to go to them before you start law school and say, I got to shut everything off for a year. I will check in periodically, but your first year is absolutely the most important year of your legal career. It will decide, which law firms extend offers to you, all that kind of stuff. It sucks that much is baked into 1 year of your life, but it is. And so and like I was saying, you will be rewarded if you're a hard worker and you're smart. And if you're watching my channel, you're smart, so you're good there. Can't say if you're a hard worker. And I think you said you're an ENTJ. So don't get overly cocky. You will get shut down very quickly if you think you know more than everybody else. You do not know more than everybody else. Just write that down and put it on your mirror. I do not know more than everybody else. If you're an ENTJ, just accept the fact that you're going to go in there not knowing anything, but nobody else does either. Nobody else does either. It's like learning a new language where you don't know anything about the language and just go for the ride, right? Eventually it'll click. There will be a day where you're just like, oh shit, now I get it, right? But nobody can explain it to you before it happens. It just happens. And it's kind of an NI thing, so that's good for you. SI wise, you don't really need a whole lot of SI, to be honest, for law school, because it's not like you're not going to get like a bunch of pop quizzes and stuff. Usually you have like one test at the end of the year, but you're making arguments, and an ENTJ can make good arguments. So just keep that in mind. My best advice also before you start, you're going to take your first year will be contracts, property, criminal law, constitutional law, and civil procedure in some order. You'll take those 6 core classes, maybe evidence, depending on which school you go to. But what you want to do is go to Amazon and find books called Examples and Explanations, Contract Law, Property Law. So there's books for examples and explanations for contract law, examples and explanations for property law, examples and explanations for con law, so on. Okay. So all of your first year classes, get those books. You can get them used. Doesn't matter if you get used ones or new ones. And before you start school, read through them as much as you can, especially contracts and property. Because what they're going to do is they're going to walk you through examples of, sort of legal scenarios. Like so-and-so went to his neighbor and said, hey, I'll mow your lawn for $50. And the guy says, I'd rather pay you 25. And the guy says, you got a deal. He walks away. He shows up the next day, mows the lawn. The owner comes back home. He's like, what the hell? He's like, you owe me $25. No, I don't owe you $25. No, you said, we had a contract. Those sorts of situations, right? And you have to walk through like, okay, who's got an argument? Both of them have an argument. And that's what you always remember. Both have an argument. And you just have to make the arguments for each of them. Do they have a contract or not? Does he owe him $25 or does he not? Both of them have an argument. There's no right or wrong answer. The thing about law school, again, what you want to remember is that it's not 2 + 2 = 4. It's what do you mean by 2? And what do you mean by 4? And what do you mean by plus, right? And so you have an argument on both sides. Read the examples and explanations. It's going to give you hundreds of those sorts of scenarios, and it's going to walk through sort of the critical topics in like con law, property law, and it walks you through, and you learn through those examples. And then they're mostly based off of real cases that courts had to decide. And so those cases or those examples or those concepts are going to be the cases in your textbook that you will go over in class. And so it'll be obvious to you, like you'll remember, like, oh yeah, that was that situation. And remember that there are always an argument on both sides. So your professor, if they're like a true, Socratic method professor, they're going to ask you, well, what do you think? And if you pick one of the sides, they'll start challenging you on the other side, right? So just, that's just the way the game works. But you have to just sort of stick to your guns and argue your side, and then eventually argue their side, and they'll get it. So that's the mindset you want to have going in. And if you can do those examples and explanations, it'll resonate a little bit more with you, where you can be like, okay, yeah, I can see why somebody would think that such and such was the case, but this other person has a good argument against it. Okay. So it's not like medical school or economics or anything where there's like a correct answer. There's never a correct answer. It's always about the arguments. So that's law school. So for what it's worth. All right. I think that's about it. Thanks everybody for listening to my rant. Hopefully I don't get in too much trouble and get this video banned because the pharmaceutical companies don't like it. But take home message is watch the rehearsal. It's interesting. I like their take on what's, or their little FE polar tests. They have a lot of little FE polar tests. They don't know that they're doing FE polar tests, but they are. Those are interesting to watch. And, but also, just be cool with the ISTJs and the IATJs. Like, it's okay to just sit and not want to talk to somebody for 2 hours and just do your job and work on your machines or whatever. It's not this guy's literally going in front of Congress, like it's this like national epidemic, problem that needs to be solved. Like, oh, it's fine. We're okay. Okay. So everybody stay okay out there, and good luck, Jonathan, in law school if I don't see you before that. All right. Bye, everybody.